Good morning all. Welcome back to Rhodes House for those of you who have come back, and welcome to Rhodes House for those of you who enjoy its wonderful ambience on a regular basis because you're here already. The forum today is put on as part of the Oxford Alumni Weekend, and we see it as a chance for Rhodes scholars past and present to get together, to network, and to have an opportunity to share in some of the intellectual vibrancy of the wider Oxford community. So we have this morning two sessions, this one which will run to approximately 11:15, then we'll take a short break and reconvene at 11:30 and have a second session with two speakers whom I'll introduce later between 11:30 and 12:30. Our first session this morning is called The Role of Culture, Arts and the Humanities in Fighting the World's Fight. Our speakers are Ms. Sarah Weir, who is Chief Executive of Waterston Manor, Dr. Eric Weir, Arkansas and Brasenose 1985, co-founder of Huan Sui Tang, and our chair is Dame Helen Ghosh. Let me say just a little bit about each of them. Sarah has held positions in cultural organisations such as the London Legacy Development Corporation, the Olympic Delivery Authority, the Arts Council of England, and the Almeida Theatre. Most recently, Sarah was Chief Executive of the Legacy List, a charity for which she was responsible for founding, and which is set up to bring arts and culture, education and skills activities to the Queen Elizabeth Park Olympic venue from now into the long-term future. It is, I hope she'll speak about this a little bit, but it is a most exciting endeavour and has its historical roots in the 1851 exhibition. A historian, teacher and critic of art and design, Eric has worked with contemporary and historical Chinese material for more than 20 years, focusing on the creation of value and meaning. He has worked with museums and galleries on exhibitions and advised local authorities and developers in China and Taiwan on sustainable cultural preservation. Eric has been involved with the selection of Rhodes scholars in Hong Kong since 1989 and has served as chairman of the selection committee from 2004. Dame Helen Ghosh is Director General of the National Trust, and she is also a Rhodes trustee. Helen joined the civil service from Oxford University, from St Hugh's College, where she read modern history. During her civil service career, Helen has worked in a number, in fact many, government departments. Most recently, in the civil service, she spent 7 years as permanent secretary, for those of you from abroad, think of it as CEO, in two departments, DEFRA and the Home Office. In late 2012, she was selected to her current position as Director General of the National Trust. So Helen, it's with great pleasure that I pass this forum over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. The format of this session, I hope, is as participative as possible. What we were invited to do was to give three angles from our own personal experience on the question before us. How humanities and the arts support fighting the world's fight. And I think you will find that when we speak, we are focusing as much on the personal aspects for current and past Rhodes scholars of what that great challenge from the founder of the Rhodes Scholarship, Cecil Rhodes, means for all of us. I think occasionally it's easy to think, particularly given, and this I'm sure is true in other countries as well as in the UK, that arts and the humanities are kind of secondary, of less importance to creating the world we want to live in than the sciences, than economics, than engineering and all those sorts of things. And when the alumni office here was thinking about a topic for this session, we felt it was very, very important to see if we could counteract that, I believe, fundamental misunderstanding. And I think you'll find, and I speak about my co-speakers, that we will have a number of different aspects. We'll talk about a number of different aspects of how we believe that it is profoundly untrue that the humanities have no part to play in fighting the world's fight. I'm going to ask Eric to say, we'll all speak for about 10 minutes, and then the majority of the session that we have is really for you, for discussion, for your ideas, for your questions. So I'm going to invite Eric to speak first.
Thank you. Right. I think I'll begin really by trying to lay out more of a framework of how I see this question, and maybe in particular how it relates to the Rhodes. Beginning really with thinking about the phrase put in front of us, this fighting the world's fight, and did a little bit of thinking about where this might come from and how Cecil Rhodes himself put this down for us. I think in some ways the origin probably turns, at least in part, from the Bible. For if we look in the King James translation of 2 Timothy 4:7, we find Paul saying, "I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith." So Rhodes may well have been thinking of this when he turned up with the phrase fighting the world's fight. I think it's also fairly possible that he was thinking of a favored text of his own, which would be Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which Rhodes was known to carry with him most of it during his travels. So that the image here of the saint, of the emperor, with their notion of clarity of purpose and self-effacing duty, acting perhaps against the odds but ultimately passing on a task to others, is something which might have appealed very much to Rhodes in thinking of the scholarships. On the other hand, he didn't actually elaborate to us what he meant by fighting the world's fight. So if I think about it more specifically now in respect to culture, arts, humanities, I would tend to look really to the criteria of the scholarships, to look for where the stakes of this may lie. We find in our memorandum that scholars are asked to demonstrate, quote, truth, courage, devotion to duty, sympathy for and protection of the weak, kindliness, unselfish and fellowship, and then moral force of character and instincts to lead, to take an interest in one's fellow beings. I think this is an appropriate starting point for thinking about how the fight connects to the arts and humanities. For in a great many circumstances, I think it even begins with that very first term, the concern for truth. The truth about how the world is organized, who benefits from that organization and how. The narratives, the institutions that protect common or protect particular interest. Knowing about these truths through the work of the arts and humanities provides the premise for pursuing justice and also the premise for creating durable communities. So I'd like to talk a little bit about three terms really, truth, hope, and sympathy. Now in respect to truth, the humanities and cultural work does a great deal in this area, to the extent that it gives us accounts of the world, trying to work out how matters stand, working out what the scope of matters are, the causes, the consequences. One would see this across particularly research in the humanities, in areas like the kinds of questioning, the kinds of research. More in the arts is perhaps an area more of speculation, of suggesting holistic images of how the world works and to whose benefit it is organized. And this in many ways is quite different than the work of many other fields, particularly to the extent that it moves aside from very narrow sorts of metrics or else particular ways of seeing the organization of things in selfish ways. This is often also connected with speaking for those whose voices have been excluded or whose experiences have been marginalized or suppressed. There is a need also from the humanities to look critically at the existing accounts that one has of history, of art, of culture, and asking, do these confirm a vision of community or do these confirm a vision of domination? So the fight, in the context of truth, in the context of this area, is one for a fight for a better truth, for a shaded, a more nuanced one, that looks hard at circumstances and looks hard at interest. And I think if we look then even more sort of specifically at what happens in the arts and humanities, we would also find that much of the work that we do in methodology or the work that's done in stylistic or technical innovation is actually aimed at this motive, at creating the tools to give us a better truth. Hope. In standing aside from how the world runs, as Helen was saying, the irrelevance of the arts and humanities, this is actually in some ways one of its strong points. Because in differing from everyday life, one is in a very strong position to ask what are the assumptions of everyday life and to draw attention to alternatives. And these alternatives span the distance from the contemporary to the historical. I think there's a great deal more merit in looking at historical work than is often recognized, to the extent that it gives us an entirely different vision of life. As one author has said, the past is a foreign country, and the question is whether we would like to live in that foreign country, because it gives us a view of how life could be organized differently, and maybe lets us know what we've given up, what we might otherwise wish to take. And all of this, in the end, gives a foundation for aspirations that are not so tightly chained up with the present and are not already compromised by pragmatism, by compromises that need to be made to get things done. This sort of gives us a space to think more freely, and I think this notion of hope that comes out of the humanities and arts is a very powerful thing that it offers to the world. Because once one has that hope, one is in a position to change social and personal orientations and embolden people to be impatient with what they have. And this is a very, very powerful thing that is offered. Eventually, this leads out to other people. So my final term here is sympathy or cooperation. By looking at the common basis of experiences, the experiences we share, we're looking at sympathy that can be developed between individuals about how they think about how they work with one another, what sort of common destiny they feel they share. This inevitably is the basis for cooperation and probably also for avoiding conflicts, or at least managing them. All of these things, too, I would want to say, and I think this is important for the context of the Rhodes, is these are global values. These are values that you will find in virtually any matured and interesting tradition. In Europe, you would probably say this grows out of classical and Christian sources. In China, which I know better, I would say this comes out of Confucian and even Buddhist material, where the image of the hero in the Confucian context is the person who dares to tell the truth, even at the cost of their position, possibly the cost of their life. These are the celebrated heroes of that tradition, and they would be quite in line with heroes one might celebrate in Europe. Now, of course, in contemporary societies, and perhaps this is where it comes to our business of fighting, the capacity of culture, art, humanity to address the truth and to contemplate problems of justice is very different from one place to the next. In places with strong traditions of civil society, there is a fairly established place for independent reflection. People are trained for independent reflection. They are allowed a variety of mature institutions to work within and generally seek open processes for exchange. So that the risk that an individual faces in a place such as the United Kingdom is much weaker. The risk of fighting for the weaker corner, for taking up the unpleasant truth, may mean less material reward, may mean less career advancement, but that's probably the limit of danger that one faces. However, elsewhere, in a great large part of the world, being an independent and frank voice is much more difficult. It means a long and lonely fight in an environment which may well be indifferent and quite possibly hostile, where there is a pervasive texture of untruths around, which makes it very difficult to work at all, and where others have been lulled into obedience, where there are many rewards for collusion, when anything which leads one to moral or even material corruption, there are many opportunities. So, if you choose to be that individual who wishes to find out the truth at all costs, you have to think about your personal safety. You have to think about the safety of your family in many cases. And perhaps most difficult in terms of your actions is you have to decide when to act, when to take on risk. Do you bide your time to the right moment, as you probably wish to, or do you find you've waited too late and missed your chance to act as you should have? This is very, very difficult, sort of moral and practical decisions. And then on top of all this, there is the problem of actually finding the facts you need. If you're in a society where those facts are pervasively hidden and the powers that be are working out hard to deceive people and in a large part control of communication, this makes the task altogether tougher, easier to accuse you of jumping on rumors and not acting in a reasonable way. But I would also say even worldwide, and certainly it's true in these more difficult places as well, much cultural activity is also not so much untruth, but is distraction. There genuinely is quite a lot of work in culture which is simply to keep us not from thinking very much, to encourage mass enthusiasm without a great deal of content. One sees this in all kinds of vacuous entertainments, but also in the abuses of community through certain manners of religion, through patriotism, through national sports. The products of culture and art, or even the work in the humanities, are not good per se in every society, and in many respects can be drawn into quite dark uses. And that brings me back, I guess, now to the Rhodes community, where I think fighting the fight is a matter of trying to find the right side with regard to morality and justice, not only in our own society, but being subtle supporters of arts and humanities really everywhere we find them. Because it's particularly important that we find ways to support those who are struggling elsewhere, realizing that in many ways, their enemies are our enemies. That this is a thing we share in common with those who are struggling to find the truth. And now I'll quickly now, by leaving the last word to Dostoevsky, who was, in speaking of his citizens in Russia in, I guess, the late 19th century, he says, quote, "They wish to sleep for the rest of their lives, simply not to see the horrors that frighten them." And so I think when we talk about the fight as it's waged by culture, arts, and humanities, a big part of our work is actually just keeping people awake.
Well, that's a wonderful segue, I think, to what Sarah is going to say. That was fabulous, Eric, and gave us a kind of philosophical framework in which to think about this challenge. All sorts of things came out of that for me. I must say, you didn't know, you can't know that wonderful quote from St. Paul, we had it as a reading at my wedding, and I hope to have it as a reading at my funeral, though I won't be there to plan it. Sarah, I think, will now be able to talk a bit about how she's been keeping people awake through her career. Sarah.
Well, I'm definitely feeling awake after Eric's stirring words. Spark Catchers. Spark Catchers was the title of one of 6 poems that we commissioned in the Olympic Park. I was responsible for the arts and culture in the Olympic Park. And it was a poem written by a poet called Lem Sissay, and it was about a big Victorian building just outside the park, which used to be owned by Bryant and May and sold matches. It was an almost entirely female workforce. There was a male boss. He wanted to build a statue of Gladstone outside the factory. And so he sent all the workers on holiday so that he wouldn't have to pay their wages, so that he could put that money towards the statue. These are people who were illiterate, earning very, very little money. They were distraught. They had no voice. They felt they didn't know what to do about this situation. Annie Besant was a socialist feminist campaigner of the time. Some of you, I'm sure, know her from the 19th century. She heard about this situation, went down, got the women together, and they went on strike. It was the very first public strike ever in this country and the beginning of the modern trade union movement. At the time, a journalist wrote about these women's plight, wrote about the strike, implored people to boycott Bryant and May, not to buy the matches, and lamented the fact that there wasn't a poet to tell their story. Lem became that poet 130 years later, and the poem is etched onto the wooden surround of an enormous electricity transformer box, which there are about 6 in the park, with these poems on them. And the end of each stanza is the word strike, which of course you will understand has both 2 very important meanings. So politically, strong poem, socially very, very important. That building, which is now flats, smart flats, became the site of surface-to-air missiles, which were put on the roof of it in advance of the Olympic Games to keep us all safe. This became a very contested issue, as again I'm sure you can imagine, for people living there, but also living around and about. And Lem had been invited by the TUC, who'd heard about his poem, to actually come and speak at their conference in 2011 and to read the poem about spark catchers. So it was already out in the public domain, and I think because of that, journalists knew it was his poem and knew about the building, so he was then asked also to comment on the surface-to-air missiles. And I was thinking about this and thinking it seemed rather a perfect way into the topic. Annie Besant, certainly, if we put it in Rhodes speak, had sympathy for and protection of the weak. And then the irony of a building which was about giving a voice to people, giving sort of political freedom to people who didn't have a voice, to then have surface-to-air missiles on it to keep us all safe. Quite what they were ever going to do with those surface-to-air missiles, I don't know. It seemed quite extraordinary. So I spent 6 years working on the park, but about 10 years thinking about the Olympics, and thinking about the Greek ideal of the Olympics, which was culture, education and sport, mind, body and spirit. It was about the wholeness of a human being. I wasn't a sporty child, but I was very inspired by the Olympics, and I was thinking in about 2004 of, not everybody is going to be Usain Bolt or Jessica Ennis or whatever. What about those young people and older people who are going to be the great musicians, the great scientists, the great philosophers, the great thinkers? How can they, and again in Rhodes speak, have the energy to use their talents to the full, and how can the Olympics be the springboard for that to happen? So a few of us started thinking about arts and culture being much more a part of the Olympics in London, because London is this global city. It has an incredibly strong artistic presence. How could we ensure that London could be that inspiration for and give a voice to and a platform to see the world differently through arts and culture and education, as well as through sport, so that we could all actually understand each other a bit better, and a place where the artists, the designers, the architects could use their talents through the imagination of their work to show us that different place, as well as the sports people. So I sort of beavered away on this behind the scenes, as many others did, and I think collectively, through a series of things we did, we did achieve that. We started the Cultural Olympiad 4 years before the Games. Every 27th of July for the 4 years before, there was a series of events to mark what would be our anniversary of the Games, which then of course came on the 27th of July 2012. Chapter 17 of London's bid book was the most determinedly strong cultural chapter I think that had ever been written, and the Arts Council funded a really imaginative series of 12 commissions for 2012, which was just a simple concept I came up with actually when I was trying to think about it, just thinking about St. Paul. I was trying to think of what can we do that's about 12, and all I kept thinking of was the 12 apostles, which wasn't really helping me enormously. And then I suddenly thought, wait a minute, 9 regions of England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, 12 commissions for 2012, and it just sort of took off. The Arts Councils funded them. A couple felt relevant to today. One was by an artist collective called Lone Twin, and they constructed a boat, a 30-foot boat called Collective Spirit. And it was a boat of people's stories and people's memories. It was made of wood. So people brought things. It could have been a part of one of these wooden chairs, their grandfather's tennis racket, wooden racket, a clothes peg, a wooden spoon, something that meant something to them. It was put together into this boat, and they had 52 thinkers that then talked about what they thought the world could be, from activists to economists to ecologists, as the boat sailed around the whole of the UK in 2011 and arrived in London in 2012. That boat still exists. It's now used for, you can actually hire it. It races, it is a proper boat, and it has everybody's stories in it, and all those stories of the thinkers has remained, and so the work still carries on from that. The second was a project by an artist called Alex Hartley called Nowhere Island. He found this island in the Antarctic, uninhabited, tiny. 23,000 people signed up to become inhabitants and constituents of this island, and a constitution was written. It was then towed 2,000 miles to England, and it arrived in England and then eventually got broken up into small pieces. I was one of those citizens. So in 2013, what arrived in my office was a padded envelope. I took it out. There was a piece of card with a tiny piece of white stone like that on the card, numbered at the bottom, and Nowhere Island had become Now Here Is Land. I thought, that is so brilliant. So brilliant. I could never sort of imagine. I didn't realise Nowhere Island is Now Here Is Land. It sits in my office always to remind me that what you see isn't always exactly the thing. There may be another meaning to it. And then in addition to those, there was, of course, the magnificent opening ceremony, woven together by Danny Boyle and his team, which, I think the cultural tapestry couldn't really have been much richer in history, but also very determinedly of now, very idiosyncratically independent and powerfully political. It showed us ourselves in a way that was both familiar and quite unexpected. I think a grand arc of who we are, but a bold marker set down of who we can be, which continues to resonate. And lastly, there were a couple of other projects which I thought felt right. One was called Peace Camp, and this was artists, it was Artichoke, the group that did it, and they were set up in 12 locations around the UK. Deborah Warner and Fiona Shaw, who are two, director and actor, were involved, and they were in sites of conflict and trouble. I happened to see 2 of them. They were tiny tents, just very, very small, sitting on the ground, lit at night. You went at night in the dark. And in these places, they were always by the sea, of conflict. One was Dunsterberg Castle, on the very relevant now between Scotland and England, where the fight happened between the Scottish and the English. Now a very calm place, but you had words coming out about peace and love. Now that might sound a little bit hippie-ish, but I can assure you the strength of the feeling, it made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you were there in the dark with a head torch on, these tiny tents, and hearing these words coming out and the sea rushing in. And lastly, Ai Weiwei did a piece in Somerset House. It was called Zodiac Heads, and it was the heads of animals from the zodiac on stakes. And this was never really discussed, but I thought to myself how extraordinary that it's there, because Somerset House was the place where births, marriages and deaths were registered, and there was something about heads on stakes in a place where births, marriages and deaths were registered that I thought was powerfully resonant, particularly from an artist who is living in sort of, captivity, I put in inverted commas, in China. So to go back, though, to end with my poem, Spark Catchers. 2011, I'm standing in the offices of a property developer who owns a lot of land around the Olympic Park. And I'm encouraging him to think about the land and the buildings that he owns, which are often have artists and creatives in them. It's quite a scruffy place. I was trying to encourage him not to just homogenise everything, take them all down, take away that sense of anarchy and character and difference that is there. And for some reason, I don't know why, we got onto the poetry. I knew he loved history, and I mentioned something about Lem Sisse's poem, Spark Catchers. And he suddenly stopped and he called out to one of his directors to come into the room, and he said, "Come in," whatever his name was, I can't remember. And he said, wasn't one of your relatives something to do with the strike at the Bryant and May factory? And this guy said, "Yeah." So he said to me, "Tell him the story." So I told him the story of the poem. This guy stood there and looked quite slightly sort of rocked by all of this, and he said, "My great-grandmother, Florence Gutteridge, led the women out on strike." And I thought, I just can't believe that moment has just happened. And I felt completely sort of connected back to the 19th century, standing in this very scruffy office. So I'm in the 21st century, but it looked like something practically out of the 19th century. But thought how powerful it is that artists have that way to take us back into history, connect us to now, but also to see forward. So my parting shot to you is to wonder, who will be the Florence Gutteridge of the middle to late 21st century, and who will be the poet to tell her story? Possibly somebody here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was marvellous. I'm going to make a link that I wasn't expecting to make, but I was inspired by something Sarah said. In all I'm going to say, I'm going to talk about an issue which is very close to my heart, which is history matters, and the way that we relate to history and understand history and where we've got to today is absolutely crucial to fighting the world's fight for tomorrow. Magna Carta is, in fact, what I wasn't expected to talk about, but I wanted to pick up from Sarah's comments about Danny Boyle's opening ceremony at the London Olympics, which focused on how we as a nation have got to where we are, but profoundly, how do we create the nation we want to be? I'm lucky enough, it's my dream job, to head an organisation called the National Trust, which is Europe's largest conservation charity. It was set up by a group of a woman in the lead, Octavia Hill, in the late 19th century, to respond to what she saw as the needs of the moment. In particular, the impact of urbanisation and the need to create green sitting rooms, open space, access to beauty for the urban poor. One of the properties among the 300 historic places in the United Kingdom that we own is Runnymede. And next year, 2015, is the 800th anniversary of I need to get this correct, the sealing of Magna Carta. And we will be organising a great celebration there with the Queen, with Commonwealth representatives, with many representatives from the United States, to celebrate what Magna Carta, something that happened 800 years ago, means today. And I've gone into this very much wanting to create an event which is like Danny Boyle's vision of the future. Why is that important? Why do I think this could resonate with the people of the Commonwealth, of the states of this country? It's because something that happened 800 years ago, even though some of the historical facts about it are a little contested, was the foundation for creating states that are based on the rule of law, that the king couldn't just throw people into prison with no trial by their peers, that Parliament did have a say in what happened. And that very profound sense is that we should not look back at 1215 and as it were, recreate King John and the barons and the bishops all at Runnymede Meadow, as the airliners, the aircraft from Heathrow make their paths over the top of us, but think about the importance of the past in creating the kinds of societies most of us are lucky enough to live in, and in which all sorts of things can flourish, whether it's the economy, whether it's industry, whether it's the arts, whether it's culture. And it just struck me that that's a very profound example of how we can celebrate that history matters. So, as I say, the National Trust owns we own 250,000 hectares of countryside, of land, 700 miles of coastline, very much back to our founder Octavia Hill's desire that people have green space to inspire them, to re-energise them, to get out and create different kinds of lives. We also, because we have at various times wanted to respond to the challenge and the threats of the day, have acquired 300 historic buildings. Our parliamentary purpose is to, quote, promote the preservation of places of historic interest and natural beauty. And if you look at the portfolio of what we look after, we've interpreted that brief in a very wide sense. So we own everything from Chartwell, Sir Winston Churchill's country house down in Kent, through to, and I was up there the other day, John Lennon and Paul McCartney's childhood homes in Liverpool, and in between, some wonderful example of what in England is called back-to-backs, kind of tenement properties in Birmingham, which are a very clear vision of how people lived in the late 19th and early 20th century. We own Disraeli's house near here. We own Hughenden Manor, where Prime Minister Disraeli lived much of his life. And we have examples in terms of architectural history of everything from wonderful Elizabethan houses through to 20th century modernism and Erno Goldfinger's house in Willow Walk in Hampstead. And we must be doing lots of things right. Over the past few years, our members in this country have grown from 1 million to 4 million members. We have 4 million members of the National Trust. We get around 20 million visits a year to our houses. We get about 200 million visits a year to our countryside. And I always remind people that when you think about the public benefit that a charity like ours, the idea that every man, woman and child in the United Kingdom is, in theory, visiting a bit of National Trust countryside 3 times a year is a simply fabulous one. But we're worried. And we're worried for 2 reasons, not just because when we look at the statistics, while the number of people visiting our countryside has grown and grown quite rapidly, people go out into our parks, look at our gardens, use our coastal paths, the number of people who are going into our houses stays more or less flat. The number of people who want to engage with that part of heritage has remained more or less flat. And when we talk to them about why they don't go into our houses more, it's absolutely clear that they feel very little or less personal connection, both with the stories that you can tell in those houses and the people who lived in them than they used to. So we've done our best. We've brought these places to life. We've taken down the ropes that stop people going and walking on the carpets and sitting on the chairs. We've lit the fires. We've had dressing up boxes for children. We have reenactments of things that happened there. We have done our best to make people feel that this isn't a Disneyland-style visitor attraction. It's something that is really relevant to their lives. But we are still, in a sense, failing. And I believe that's profoundly important. And as a new chief executive, I am passionate that we need to make people feel that heritage, that history is relevant to their lives. Not just because of the great events that happened or with which the people who live in these places were connected, but very much just the ordinary challenges, the challenges in the personal lives of people, whether it's the people who lived in the back-to-backs in Birmingham or Churchill at Chartwell. And I think if we can understand both those things, and both Sarah and Eric have expressed this very eloquently, that ensures that we can all, not just the Rhodes community, but everyone in society, can fight the world's fight in a more profound and successful way. In a sense, I don't think we have to argue that history matters. I think you only have to turn on the television, you only have to look at the news, you only have to see what's happening in the Ukraine, that's happening in the Middle East, that happened this week in Scotland, to understand that people's lives are profoundly shaped by history. If the Sykes-Picot Agreement had been rather a different one in terms of how the borders and frontiers were aligned in the Middle East, would the terrible events that are happening there at the moment have happened? I have set a challenge for people in the National Trust, and I have said we need to be part of that public debate about why history matters. I wanted to give a couple of examples. First is at, indeed, Chartwell. I was down at Chartwell, which is a very nice, quite small country house in Kent, wonderful views over the countryside. Churchill used it as his family home through the 30s, through wartime, late into his life. And I was there with a group of our US supporters, people who, I'm very happy to say, raise money for the National Trust, called the Royal Oak Foundation. And before I met them, they'd had a tour of Chartwell with one of our wonderful volunteer tour guides. This very highly well-educated US colleague spoke to me afterwards, and he said, I had no idea until I came to Chartwell and went round and heard the story of his life. I knew everything about Churchill as the great war leader, but I had no idea about the period of his life when he was in the political wilderness, where he thought that his career was over, where his view of international foreign relationships was very unfashionable. I had no idea about all of that. And more profoundly, he had no idea about what Churchill called his black dog, the depression that stalked him throughout his life. And he said, I've come out of this experience with a completely different view about Churchill as a leader, about the challenges that faced him, about what created him as the leader that could lead Britain through the Second World War. Interestingly, our manager there, Zoe, had shortly before been actually facilitated by a friend from Royal Oak up to Hyde Park, up to Roosevelt's house in New York State, and had spoken there about the challenge they have even now, and I have to say Roosevelt is one of my great life heroes, in getting visitors to understand who Roosevelt was, what was the significance of Roosevelt. And again, insofar as visitors there knew anything about him, they focused on the war years. Very few of them knew about his personal struggle, his struggle with polio, the extent to which he had to disguise that. Very few of them knew about the history of his relationships with his wife. Very few of them had really focused on the New Deal and the transformational effect that Roosevelt had had there. And again, they came away with a transformed view from their visits there of what real leadership means in that context. We can also do much more in an organisation like us about explaining about events. As I said, we own Hughenden Manor near High Wycombe, a stone's throw down the A40. And there we have one room which is dressed as Disraeli's study in 1878. And as historians in the room will know, 1878 was the year of the Congress of Berlin, which is when the great Western powers got together to try and deal once and for all with the so-called Eastern question, carving up the Balkans, getting Russia's role in around the Black Sea, and the tottering Ottoman Empire propped up. I commented when I visited recently, you would not go into that room. You see his ministerial red box, you see a map on the wall of the Eastern Mediterranean. Do we talk to people? Do we say to people, they didn't solve it, that Eastern question. The debates that they were having there about how you contain the role of Russia, how you deal with all the various religious and ethnic conflicts in the Ottoman Empire, they thought they had dealt with it at the Congress of Berlin, but look how those questions still go on. And when you turn your laptop on or your television on, think about what happened in 1878. And when you hear about the great world leaders joining together to solve this problem once and for all, understand how difficult it is They didn't solve it now, they didn't solve it then, and they may well not solve it now. So I believe profoundly that through culture, through heritage, through explaining in that way that history matters, we can make people think differently, both about their personal leadership struggles and the world we live in now. I just wanted to end by saying, and it's not just top people. I was very moved when I was on a visit over to New York, again, a fundraising visit, to visit the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side in New York. It is exactly what it says on the tin, a museum run by a local trust, which shows you the lives of immigrant communities living in tenements, mainly on arrival from Europe and elsewhere. I did a tour with a wonderful leader about an Irish family who'd turned up. They turned up in, I think, the 1860s. They were moving into a community that was fundamentally German and Lutheran, and they were despised. They were looked down on by the German Lutheran community who'd got there first as poor, ignorant, primitive. And it told, as we walked around this house, we were told the story of their lives, their family lives, their relationships. And the tour guide pointed out, she told this story about how they were despised, they were at the bottom of the heap. And then she said, and then the Italians came along. And happily for the Irish, they were able to look down on the Italians and explain that the Italians were at the bottom of the heap. And they were the primitive, ignorant people who'd come in the next wave of immigration. And she just looked round at this very international group of visitors she was showing around, and she said, now what does that remind you of now? And so she had made that connection from that visit, from that heritage. Absolutely, finally, I just wanted to quote a great cultural leader in this country, Sir Neil MacGregor, who heads up the British Museum. And I and some of my National Trust colleagues went to see him the other day to talk about his approach to how he presents history and culture at the British Museum, to see what we could learn from him. An enormously successful museum, an enormously successful cultural leader. And he said, the mission of the British Museum is to help people understand the world they live in now. He explained that their founder, Hans Sloane, Sir Hans Sloane, in the 18th century, had collected contemporary items, shoes from around the world, which he wanted in a newly founded British National Museum. He wanted people to see so that they thought about the society, about the culture, about the shoes that they wore now. What he did not want the British Museum to be was just a way of looking back in an antiquarian way at the past. So that is what the British Museum is trying to do. So what it doesn't do is keep buying bits of, for example, ancient Egyptian pottery or hieroglyphics or statues. What it does is buy things that help people now understand the world we live in now. And the example he gave was that they are establishing a collection of teapots and it's close history, but if not absolutely contemporary, teapots made in China under the rule of Chairman Mao. There are, and Eric will know much more about this than I, many households have teapots, all of which have a picture of Chairman Mao on them. The British Museum believes that that is a much more important thing to collect than something that was produced thousands of years ago. So history matters to create the leaders who can fight the world's fight, and I believe that the Rhodes community has a key part to play in that. Thank you. And now, for the last half hour, it's absolutely over to you. I think there were some wonderful things. I was sort of jotting down I would want to ask some questions about, but I'm sure you've got lots and lots of questions in your head. Thoughts? Challenges? Are we all wrong? Does history matter? There, at the back.
I actually live in the Middle East, and when you talk about the Middle East,
yes,
and a lot of dealings right now with Russia and Ukraine. So when you now talk about history, 1978, etc., what do you think was happening in Russia and Ukraine today, and what has history got to help us in learning how the Russia and Ukraine issues are issued?
Well, I think you're the person who's qualified to answer that question, aren't you? Oh, do you agree with the fundamental thesis that history is absolutely crucial?
Unfortunately, I'm not on the history side of things.
Oh, right.
I'm on the banking side of things.
Right. Which is also very helpful.
But I'm grappling with myself with what's going to happen, how that entire Eastern European is going to shape up. Seeing the fact that a lot of international powers are staying away, except putting on sanctions against Russia. Well, how are we going back to the era where one country is going to stop taking over other countries, the international power is going to put? What's history going to teach us about that? Especially politicians.
Well, please come in, other people, but I think the conclusion I draw from, I'm far from being able to give the answer to what is the answer to the Eastern question at last, but I do believe very profoundly that international leaders need to understand about history. And I very much hope that whether it's Obama or Cameron or President Hollande or whoever it is who is now engaging with these problems, they are being, those crucial historical foundations are being explained to them, because sometimes you suspect that they take these problems as though they're completely fresh. Good heavens, why are these things happening? But to be able to understand why some communities feel so wounded by what happened in the past and are still carrying those wounds from hundreds of years ago, they have to understand that any settlement needs to provide for that kind of emotional aspect for any problem. And again, my observation is that one of the problems that we have now is that, and again, it's very much reflected in what happened in the 19th century, everything is connected. The relationships with Russia over the Ukraine are connected to getting Russia to cooperate, collaborate, to support nations in the right way when you move over to the Middle East. So understanding why and where all of those countries and communities are coming from, I think, is the starting point. John.
All three of you made very compelling case for the role of culture, arts and humanities in taking the fight. In fact, I don't want to case. But you started out by asserting correctly that the fact it's not flavour of the month in terms of political allocation or anything else. So there's a big paradox here about our society. On one hand, the extraordinary statistics about the National Trust visitations, membership and the likes, the wonderful story of the arts and cultures of the Olympics, Eric's compelling philosophical arguments. But on the other hand, society in its political form is reacting. Humanities funding in the universities is being slashed. Please spread the circles.
Sarah.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, because although, I might have told a story and you thought, yes, how wonderful arts and culture being a part of the Olympics, it was not originally. So when the London bid was done and Chapter 17 was written and we made a strong case for arts and culture, the Olympic Park had no arts and cultural strategy for it. It had no arts and culture in it. It was not a part of what was called the Blue Book that was first written. So I was sort of pushing away. I was running Arts Council London then, and we did a lot of consultation around East London about whether people thought it should be a part of the park. And overwhelmingly, people felt that it should, that we should be able to tell the story, and we'd have a leave behind of culture, education, and sport in the park. So we sort of pushed and pushed, and eventually in 2007, the Olympic Delivery Authority said, fine, we'll take it on for a year. We'll do something for arts and culture. I actually then, I left the Arts Council, and without another job to go to, actually, I just decided to make a change. And the people at the Olympics rang me to say, okay, you did all this work, you pushed us to do it, we've taken it on, now would you come and deliver it? So I never imagined in a million years I'd end up delivering the thing that I'd been wanting them to do. So I arrived there, and there was no strategy, no money, no people. People just looked at me as if I was completely insane. They said, well, so who are you? Art? No, we're doing sport. We're building a park. we're construction. We're engineers. We're planners. What are you talking about? Art, artists. The very first thing I did was to think about the memory of London 2012 and think there were lots of bridges built in the park, 36 bridges. And I thought, taking my idea of 12 things for 2012, are there 12 bridges that we could do something which would be a memory of 2012? Yes, there were 12 that looked the same. And I thought, could we think about maybe the colour of the logo? I don't know if you remember, the logo was orange, blue, pink, green. Paint the underside of these very simple bridges that colour, so that when they're left behind in years and years to come, people have forgotten all about the Olympics, but there's just that little flash of memory about something. You would think that I'd tried to ask to, change the world. The engineers and the construction people were like, no, bridges are grey or green. That is it. That is it. They are not pink, not blue, not orange, etc. I can still remember the first meeting where somebody in advance of the meeting said to someone else at the table, she wants to do a pink bridge. And this guy is quite a big guy, big stomach. He folded his arms like this. I can't do his London accent. He said, I am not doing a pink bridge. Well, let me tell you, I had to do 3 creative sessions to get everyone on board. By the end of it, he was the one, once they'd done the bridges and they looked beautiful, that kept sending me photos, endless photos. Thought you might like this, Sarah, it's the sunshine, because what happens is the reflection of the colour, you can see it in the water. Yeah. And I knew that. I knew in my head that's what was going to happen. But it was a really, really tough gig. I mean, you talked about long and lonely path. The evaluation done of the work that we did, which took 5 years, was called Square Pegs in Round Holes. And that is exactly what I and my team of 3 people felt like. But we, over 5 years, managed to leverage £40 million and do over 40 permanent commissions. But it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because everyone in the beginning, I remember a meeting at the stadium and going in, somebody said, look, they're talking about the stadium. This is right in the early days. They're not being very creative. Go in there and, do something. So I walk into this room of men, and it was almost entirely white men. They're all standing, looking at a wall, looking at architectural drawings. I'm not an architect. I don't even understand really what the hell they're doing, talking about things in technical language I don't understand. They say something, and I think, that sounds like that could have a creative opportunity. And I said, are you working with an artist on that? I'm not joking, to a man. They all turned round, looked at me and went, what? I could just see them all like, what? Has she just mentioned the word artist? Who is she? So as we walked out of the room, someone said to me, who are you? And I said, well, I'm Sarah Weir, I'm the head of arts and culture. And he said, have you got any money? And I said, no, not at the moment. He said, well, I won't want to work with you. By the end, we inserted into the stadium, every set of stairs, there were 36 sets, were a series of colours which were anchored by the 4 colours of the Olympic ring. Just very simple, they're glass, they're still there now, glass colour. So you have a colour wheel, and the four Olympic colours are the main ones. And by the end of it, he was the one that pushed for that, and he was our advocate. And so I got him on side in the end. But we had to infiltrate. And it wasn't easy, and it is sidelined, and the politicians kept trying to cut the budget that didn't even exist in the first place. And, there's a lot of talk about, the value of arts and culture. When it comes to it, no, it's often not really seen to be important. We're just the side of it. So my goal was to have arts and culture as part of the park, not just an add-on to the park. But often we are just an add-on.
Yeah. Eric?
I just wanted to echo what Sarah's saying. I think the sense of where this work takes place is everywhere. There are so many different organizations, aside from those that come from central funding, that have something to do with the image we take, whether it's of history or of culture, because these are ongoing constructions. I mean, what we think of as a stable history of the past is very different 100 years ago, 200 years past. The work of setting that in motion now has palpable effects on what people believe is true around them and what they may feel they wish to act upon. To take a trivial example, I mean, in my work in art history, I see lots of, say, auction catalogs from the likes of Christie's and people like this. If you look at the description of objects, one of the key words, maybe the first word you see after the object is named, is where it's from. So is the object Chinese? Is it Tibetan? Is it from a state which no longer exists, which is now part of China? This would be the kind of thing which anywhere in the world one might look at. How do we even identify the material fabrics of history? Are they Athenian? Are they Greek? These tells us about divisions that we might take an interest in. So I think this work happens all around us. It happens in our own conversations. It happens in the work that people who don't believe that they're acting on this are in fact doing. That's really what I was sort of, again, seeing how this work is everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think partly going back to my previous public government life, I think the kind of arts, culture, humanities world hasn't done, but we've started to be able to have sensible discussions about the importance of the arts and culture in ways that ring bells with the economists. So the fact that we have wonderful houses that tourists from around the world will want to visit, and therefore you can kind of you can tick some kind of economic external overseas investment box on that. And I think we've started to be able to tell the story that, for example, big companies, big international companies want to come to London, and therefore their executives want to come to London, and that's very good for our economy, partly because of the absolutely fabulous, and Sarah once ran the Arts Council London, fabulous cultural cuisine, just the physical nature of the fabric of London. They want to come here. Where I don't think we've cracked it, and again some economists are beginning to work on this, some people in this room probably know more than I do, is how does all of that together, how does that sense of understanding your roots, understanding where you're going, the kind of spiritual refreshment people get from the arts, how is that reflected in GDP? That kind of economic work, happiness indicators, and so on. And that's incredibly slow. Well, it's almost even slower than how we get economists to value the value of the environment, but that's a completely different story. So, if there is a kind of intellectual project to get going, for me, it's that how do arts, culture, heritage make society genuinely more valuable, and how can we build it into GDP? That would be the challenge for me.
But there's also the social cohesion.
Absolutely.
Question and the likes. Would you like just to continue on that?
Well, I can talk about it from
the context that you're on.
Yeah, I mean, in the context that I am in, and both Sarah and Eric, I think, will have their own insights. So one of the things that worries us at the National Trust is this sense, partly because, again, just because we were responding to the needs of the time, all these large country houses, historic houses in England, were just being knocked down between the two world wars in the 20th century. Taxation, first eldest sons killed in the First World War. They were just going at a rate of knots. And so the National Trust stepped in with help from the Treasury and a special tax deal, which is why we own these large 18th, 19th, 17th and 16th century houses. How you make those seem relevant to the multicultural, multi-ethnic populations who now live up close with these places is very challenging. To some, they represent colonialism. They represent, in fact, a minute proportion, though we're constantly having this debate, were actually built on the proceeds of whether slavery or colonialism, but they represent something that does not seem relevant to the lives of the Pakistani families living in the middle of Leeds. So how do we get at that? Well, one of the ways we try and get at it is by trying to identify and be very honest about the elements of the history of these places that links to other communities, and get people in to celebrate it. So, for example, at one of our kind of grandest properties up near in Cheshire, Dunham Massey, we told the story of and had a grand Rastafarian celebration and festival there, because Haile Selassie had visited in the 1930s when the then owner, Lord Stamford, who was a very enlightened liberal person, had invited him over to stay to hear about the situation in Abyssinia, as it then was. So we try and use those opportunities to do that. We try and make these places very ungrand. Please come in. You don't have to stay for half an hour or 2 hours and wander around with a guide and read lots of footnotes and so on and so forth. You can just come in for a moment and see just one object that will really fire and inspire you. And we try to now acquire places that people will feel relate to their lives, which is why things like the Beatles houses and the back-to-backs in Birmingham are a very useful tool to us. But it is fantastic. It's a fantastic challenge that I worry about a lot.
I think, yes, the sense of spiritual nourishment, I think that's very important. Helen mentioned it already, and I think in a much more secular society, people search for it. We all have a need to, we search for something to feel connected to. And I think quite often arts and culture can be the way of that connection, maybe even if you don't think about it overtly. Sometimes it's words that are off-putting. I was just thinking as you were talking about a couple of instances I can remember very clearly, just thinking about the word poetry, which can be very off-putting to people. There was one of the engineers actually who worked on the park, and I knew he'd lived locally all his life, and I was thinking that actually the Spot Catcher's poem might be interesting to him. So I said to him, I've got some poetry I thought you might like. He said, oh, I don't do poetry, Sarah. So I just left it on his desk and I didn't say anything about it. And I saw him a few days later and he said, oh, you know that thing you left for me? He said, that's about Bryant and May, isn't it? He said, oh, well, I like that because I know what it's about. And when I left the park, there was one of the security people, I have to say, had been, we'd had a sort of challenging set of discussions, shall we say, over a period of 6 years. And he said to me, he said, when you arrived, I just didn't know what you were talking about. I don't do art, I didn't understand anything you were doing. But he said, now, the sort of twists that you put into the park, he said, I think they're the best things. So he said, when you all leave, he said, don't worry, I'll look after it for you. And I thought, that's really rather wonderful, but I think that perhaps sometimes the words make people feel uncomfortable. And I was thinking about your storytelling. So I run Waddesdon Manor, and it's something which has been exercises me non-stop. I've been there for 10 months. It was built by the Rothschilds in 1870. So it's not fantastically old, or in English terms, not fantastically old, but it's built to look like an 18th century French chateau. And from the very early days, it has a fantastic collection of things inside it, 18th century things. He wasn't interested in contemporary, interested in old. But from very, very early on, it was originally built as a theatre. It was built as a weekend house. You came up to the front door, you looked through just 2 rooms, straight through into a most magnificent garden. So the sense of inside and outside were extraordinarily important. Quite early after he died, the curtains were all brought down for conservation reasons, to keep everything perfect. So we've lost the sense of inside, outside. And it's exercised me from the first moment I saw the house, because it's very dark, and I absolutely understand conservation, I understand all of that sort of thing. But what we're working on is for 2016 so you'll stand at that front door, you'll look through the first room. In the second room there is a Savonnière carpet, most magnificent carpet. And we can now get that carpet digitized so that we roll the real carpet up and take it away, put down the digital carpet, open the curtains, and then you look straight through from the front of the house to the back of the house to the garden. And then we will copy the pattern on the carpet, which is the Sun King, into a huge area of carpet bedding, which I've already spotted, out in the garden. And I think that might be one way to really tell the story differently. So I'm looking forward to that one.
History should be able to connect life and living today.
Yeah.
I think that has to be told from a very young age.
Yeah.
In my field, I come across children, and I deal with children from the age of 8 to 18 on a daily basis in my field. And I come across many who say that the first thing, when I get to choose my GCSEs, the first thing I'm going to do is to drop history. Right? So I said, why? I said, what is it going to happen? Why do I have to study the past? So I think, whether it's within schools, within universities, to make it easier, we have to teach the children from primary age how history connects who you are today and how it will connect to you in the future, so that they generate that enthusiasm of taking it at a later stage. I deal with university applicants. I mean, I get many say, we want to do medicine, we want to do politics, we want to do law, but I hardly get anybody saying, I want to do history. I have a son and a daughter. My daughter absolutely loves history. My son, he says, the first thing I do when I have to choose my GCSEs is to drop history. I said, why? He says, I don't understand what's the point of it. So I think it has to start at a young age.
I entirely agree. 2 there and there. Oh, stop, that's the one. We'll start with the microphone.
To add that I think it would be nice if we could broaden our conception of history, because history is also a kind of a pleasure thing that's a little bit inexplicable. And I think if we consider things like how things are made, that children would become very engaged with it. One of the most interesting trips I ever had to the Tower of London was with 2 10-year-olds and a builder, a retired builder. And he, I'm a professional historian, he opened my mind as to how everything was made. He was just a really clever chap. And he was showing me how this was made this way and that way and why, etc. And it occurred to me that the same thing could be done with country houses, because craftsmanship is something that all kinds is valuable today. Apprenticeships, people taking pride in being able to make amazing things out of wood. I mean, if we trace the history of all the many luxurious objects that, yes, only the wealthy could own, but lots and lots of people in workshops were involved in making. So I hope your strategy is going to
That's a really good idea.
broadening history way beyond
Yes.
politics and even the Downton Abbey factor, which is another thing I'm sure you've investigated.
Yeah.
But I really think it's more so for the country houses.
Yes, I must say we started showing our kitchens and our pantries and our housekeepers' rooms long before Downton Abbey, but it is something that people love. You're quite right. There was somebody here? Have we got a microphone over this side? Yes, and then we'll move over here. Gentleman there.
So one thing that seems to be coming up is how do we make the case for the importance of arts, humanities in a world where the case for the importance of economics and technology seems to be self-evident somehow, but it seems to be less argument necessary. And I wanted to take you up on something you said earlier, that one of the greatest challenges is perhaps to establish the economic value of arts. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot from different perspectives. My background is the social sciences, which sits between the hard sciences and the humanities, and especially political science. And I work on health policy, and especially the question of how to mobilize attention, political attention, resources for health, for the health of people, where there's very little economic value in helping people, poor people in our societies and other societies for diseases that are not many people that are affected by these kind of issues. And one interesting observation we've made in the last couple of decades is that the issue or the topic received a lot more political attention when the argument was established and evidence was produced that health and well-being is important for economic development. Yeah. That was when the issue got on the political agenda of governments around the world, and a lot of money was made available for investment in this. So, on one hand, that seems to support the case that you were making, that it is important to connect sort of soft issues such as culture or health or social protection to hard issues related to money and technology. On the other hand, from my own work, I'm torn whether this really should be the way.
Yes. Are we playing their game? I mean, we have this debate in my organisation. I guess we've all done this, which is the moment you start saying, let's see if we can put an economic value on. I mean, let's take a different area. Skylarks. You know, how many skylarks do we need? What's the value of a skylark? Because the government does, in fact, the EU does slightly subsidise skylarks. People say that's disgusting. It's, of course, some things are so intrinsically valuable, you shouldn't play the game. On the other hand, sometimes you do have to play the game. You know, the nature of a wonderful society, it must be more than just money and economics, and it's got something about it. And I think the Scottish debate has shown that. There's something about a healthy society that is more than just economics.
Well, I think absolutely, and I think the comments on history sort of echo this. I mean, not every society has imagined that its goods were all based around an economic metric. I mean, this is a rather novel and possibly rather absurd way of seeing a society's, value. And no society in the past would have ever imagined evaluating itself on that basis alone. And I think that argument should be made rather strongly.
Yeah. Have we got time just for one more? This gentleman here has been asking a question.
I think one of the reasons why history is so important and matters today is because of the culture of short-termism that we live in.
Yeah.
I mean, just take an example from South Africa, of course, that's linked to what you've been doing there. Nelson Mandela's prison cell on Robben Island has become a kind of shrine or must-visit place And I think one of the reasons why that became really important is because one of the really inspiring things about Nelson Mandela was that he was willing to play the long game. And he didn't even know that the game would actually work out.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's inspiring. That goes against this culture of the quick fix and people only having a limited term. You've got to go back to that longer view. And some things that's really important is take a long time to happen. And we've got to go with it.
And that on your leadership journey, you will have those periods when it all seems hopeless and that you will never succeed. Again, reflecting it back into fighting the world's fight. It's a fabulous example. John.
Okay. Well, look, on your behalf, I'd really like to offer very special thanks to our distinguished panel for what has been a fascinating session. So would you join with me, please, in thanking them?